Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Pied Piper of Pasadena, part 14. This is the story of Dean Corll. On October 3rd, 1972, 14-year-old Wally Simoneau would go walking with his friend, 13-year-old Richard Habri. Along the way, they would be lured and abducted by both Henley and Brooks and taken to Dean Corll's apartment. And under duress, they would try to make 13-year-old Habri phone his mother. And under duress and frightened, as soon as his mother would answer the phone, he would yell out, "Mama." Habri's mother would later claim that at that point she heard a bunch of rustling and the phone line went dead. She would then go call Wally Simoneau's parents and tell them about the strange phone call. And it is at this point that they had informed them that they were still waiting for the kids to arrive home. And it is at that point afterwards that they would go to the police department to file them missing. The next following morning, Henley would wake up before Dean Corll or David Brooks and had thought that he would torture both boys by himself. He would take out a .20 caliber pistol and put it in one of the boys' mouths, and it would misfire. And the misfire would do a non-fatal shot and exit out of the back of the boy's neck. After which, Henley would begin strangling both boys. After he had killed both boys, they would be buried at the boat shed. On November 1st, 1972, Willard Branch Jr. would be lured to Dean Corll's apartment by Henley. Henley would walk up to Branch and ask him if he wanted to smoke some weed. And Branch would get in the vehicle and Henley would drive them to Dean Corll's apartment. Also keep in mind is at this time that Elmer Wayne Henley was driving without a license. Once Branch was inside the apartment, they would get him intoxicated. He would be tortured, sodomized, castrated, and shot in the head with a .20 caliber pistol. He too would be buried at the boat shed. The one thing that was different about Willard Branch Jr. was he was the son of a police officer. And because he was the son of a police officer, there would be an investigation. But Mr. Branch, the father of Willard Branch, would actually suffer a fatal heart attack out of fear of not finding his son. And after his death, it would ultimately just end the investigation altogether. On November 17, 1972, Richard Kepner would be seen walking over to a phone booth to call his fiancée, and he would be lured by Dean Corll to his apartment. Kepner would be subject to Dean Corll's normal MO, torturing, sodomizing, and strangulation, and he would be buried on High Island Beach. Richard Kepner's body would not be discovered until 1983, and originally when his body was discovered, he would not be put in with the other categories of victims of Dean Corll, mainly due to his age, being that when he was murdered he was 19 years old. On January 20th, 1973, Dean Corll would move to an apartment over on Spring Branch, and David Brooks would actually move to a residence that was roughly about a block away from Dean Corll. And it is at this time that David Brooks had began dating a neighbor in his area named Bridget Clark. And during this time, both Dean and David would become acquainted with Joseph Lyles. And on February 1st, 1973, without the company of Brooks or Henley, Dean Corll would lure Joseph Lyles into his apartment and begin torturing, sodomizing, and strangling him. And he would actually bury Lyles on a beach over in Jefferson County, which sits about 75 miles outside of Houston. His body would not be discovered until 1983, and it would not be identified as Joseph Lyles until DNA testing was further done, and which point finally his body and remains were given to the Lyles family. On March 1st, 1973, Dean Corll would move again, this time to 2020 Lamar Drive over on Pasadena. It has also been said that the house was originally owned by his father Arnold, but when Arnold would go and get remarried, he would leave the residence and Dean Corll would take over the house. It's around this time that Henley would actually begin trying to distance himself from Corll and would actually move in with his father in Mount Pleasant, Texas. And he would get a job and try to join the Navy, which he would ultimately be rejected. And he would be rejected on June 20th, 1973. Between the months of February and May, there would actually be a hiatus of the Candyman murders. Most would speculate at the time Dean Corll would actually get a condition where it causes the testes to actually swell up and become increasingly painful for any type of movement, making any kind of sexual activity almost impossible. But he would actually go into a doctor's office and have it actually drained and get the problem fixed. But also during this time frame, it has also been said around 12 different teenagers would actually go missing. But these teenagers would not be connected to Dean Corll or the Candyman disappearances, even though right around most of these teens' disappearances, someone matching the description of Dean Corll would be right around the area. While still waiting on his ill-fated Navy application, Henley would actually move back in near where David Brooks and Dean Corll once lived, and they would begin hanging out at a chicken restaurant where they would begin talking and hanging out and also conversating with 7th graders within the restaurant. Henley was about 17 at this time, and he would actually start having Dean Corll come over to his mother's house to hang out, have dinner, and so on. But Henley's mother would also be very uncomfortable around Dean Corll because, in her words, he would just sit down and stare at everyone while everyone just kind of talked. And it made her and other family members fairly uncomfortable. Henley would later say that he agreed to start abducting and procuring more teenage boys for Dean Corll because Dean Corll around this time had become very fond with one of his younger brothers a little too much, and had just decided that he would start procuring more boys for Dean Corll so he wouldn't target his younger brother. On June 4th, 1973, 15-year-old Billy Lawrence would call his father and ask him to drop him off in between 31st and Yale Street. Before being dropped off, Billy's father would actually look at Billy and tell him, "I love you, son," because his wife had recently passed away and his father had made it a point to always tell his children that he loved him. And Billy would get out of the car. He would later call Billy's father later on that evening and say that he wanted to go fishing with some friends, to which his father would agree to this and would say, "I love you, son," to which Billy replied, "I love you too, Dad." Those friends would be Dean Corll, Elmer Wayne Henley, and David Brooks. And instead of taking him fishing, they would take him to 2020 Lamar Drive, and for the next 3 days, they would subject Billy to not only torture, but also sexual assault. After subjecting Billy to 3 days of torture and sexual assault, Henley would then make Billy write a letter to his father, James, that he had taken a job in Austin and would be returning back to school in August. After which they would strangle him and bury him at Lake Sam Rayburn. Once James received the letter, he would take it to the police, and the police would say that nothing seemed out of the ordinary and would more or less class Billy as a runaway. Right after going to the police, James would wait for the return of his son. After which, Henley would recently call up James and ask about his son, to where he would tell him about the letter. And on one night when James went to work, Dean Corll, David Brooks, and Elmer Wayne Henley would actually break into James's home and begin stealing certain mementos of Billy. The fact that James had not only lost a wife, but lost a son, and to add on to it that they began robbing his home to steal mementos of his son, just more or less kind of shows you the adding insult to injury and just the lack of empathy these men had.